Neuvillette is back, and since my last video is much outdated, I decided to make 7 more advanced tips for every Neuvillette main. From his release to today, Neuvillette kept getting new teams, interesting techs and improvements, and also a fair amount of weapons. And between those, even his probably best new free-to-play option. As always in these in-depth videos, I will assume you already know how Neuvillette works, so that we can directly talk about more advanced topics. This is not a comprehensive guide. I'm going to give you a few mechanical tips first, and then talk about some new findings. The first is a very well-known tech that Neuvillette has to offer. He can start his charge attack earlier by releasing the attack button as soon as the source water droplets have been absorbed. This trick by itself won't save that much time, but when accounting that Neuvillette gets multiple charge attack off in a rotation, it can be quite the advantage. 4 charger attacks, which as we will see later is somewhat of a rotation standard, with this tech can save almost 3 seconds. This works on PC, mobile and controller. But for PC users, there is another tech that even people that don't have Neuvillette know about. I'm not going to stop on this much since it's just silly in my opinion, but increasing a mouse DPIs to spin the camera during a charge attack will simply hit everyone in a 360 degrees area around them. Given enough speed, there shouldn't be too much damage loss. Really, this is just silly, but how you attempt to fix it completely backfired and affected normal gameplay as well, so here we are. Now, while there is no limit on how many source water droplets that can be at a time, you can end up missing one of them or having them expire a bit too early. I'm sure this happens to many players that just improvise their rotations. And while Neuvillette is definitely not a character that needs a very precise action order, there are a few things we can do to optimize his on-field time. Source water droplets expire after 15 seconds, which is a long time, but Neuvillette does not absorb them in a particular order. He will not prioritize the one that were summoned first, but we still want to open a team rotation with a skill or burst because that's generally the approach that will not only make best use of our time and the time of our buffs, it's also the best way to deliver more charger attacks. Let's take one of his current best teams, Furina, Kazuha and Shilonen. We can open with Neuvillette's skill and go straight into our team. Furina skill, Shilonen skill, 2 normals burst, Furina burst, Kazuha skill, Neuvillette. Here every single buff we have is online and we even builded up a fair amount of fanfare stacks from Furina. We can now do the first charger attack, the skill is now back, so another one and then we cast our burst. It's time to refresh our buffs, so Shilonen skill, 2 normals, Kazuha skill, back to Neuvillette for the last 2 charger attacks. If somehow anything is alive, you can restart the rotation from here. What we are doing is skill, teammates abilities, on-field Neuvillette, teammates abilities again, on-field Neuvillette. We're splitting his 4 charged attacks in 2 quick mini rotations. This is an optimized approach that works great in this example because Furina's buff can last for almost all the charge attacks, and somehow we're still getting full benefit from Kazuha's shorter buff window. I have to admit that this is not exactly energy friendly, but a version that starts with a burst is also possible. And while making this video, I found a rotation bank from the KQM group with an incredible amount of different teams that can be taken inspiration from. It also includes more particular teams and free-to-play friendly options. This resource is not perfect by any means, but it includes some great examples. I will leave a link in the description. I found it particularly useful for Vaporite teams as those can be a bit weirder to play. For the next tip, I want to stop at weapons. Neuvillette has seen quite a number of new options since Natlan got released, and arguably a new best free-to-play weapon. And I want to talk about it because plenty of guides here on YouTube are outdated and because the banner of the 5.2 rerun is, well, not so great. Losing to Vortex Vanquisher is definitely not ideal. So I made an updated spreadsheet of Neuvillette weapons where I considered the presence of Furina and another buffer. That could be Kazuha plus healer or Shilonen plus 1. As you can see, Neuvillette still rocks his old options to very high regard. But looking at the new weapons, we have Ring of the Aksha, which should not even be considered as it's a straight downgrade from Prototype Ember. Ashgraven Drinking Horn is instead free if you play during 5.0 and is another possible upgrade from Prototype Ember. I assume 2 triggers and as you can see it's performing quite okay. Surf's Up is another new option that only works as a stud stick with massive crit damage and some HP. The usual big winners are still Sacrificial Jade and his signature of course. Since I was doing all these calcs, I also decided to check out a Hydro Goblet versus an HP Goblet for the Furina plus Buffer scenario. And to no one's surprise, HP Goblet is such a competitive option that it can be better and is absolutely worth considering when using a crit damage percentage weapon. This is also reflective on the substat, so please don't ignore them. In so many scenarios, an HP percentage substat can be equal to a crit one. Moving on, there are also two visual clues that Neuvillette has that can be important in combat. One from his Draconic Stacks and one for his charge attack range. We will come back to the charge attack later in this video as I found something very weird about it, but for now, let's stop at the Draconic Stacks. This simply track the amount of Hydra-related reactions triggered by anyone in the team. And these stacks are a massive damage increase, since they are a completely different multiplier. They are the reason why teams with 3 different elements at C0 are still very competitive to Furina teams. They are also the reason why C1 is so looked after, since the combo of C1 plus Furina would allow one of his best teammates to work perfectly with him. And since many players might look into either his C1 or his signature weapon, let's talk about both. If you were to vertically invest into Neuvillette, numbers matter until a point. I can show you how much of a damage increase his weapon or his first constellation are, but that will not give you the entire picture. Generally on most weapons, and accounting for a Furina team, C1 is a 24-ish damage increase, simply because we're going from 2 to 3 Draconic Stacks. His signature, however, from a free-to-play option can be upwards of 35% better. But that doesn't mean you should go for it. When looking at vertical investment, I would ask a few questions. If you have any of his best weapons, ideally Sacrificial Jade even on low refinements, C1 is the way to go. But if you don't and your team is going to have 3 Hydra related reactions, then technically his best in slot will be quite better than C1. There is also an aspect of C1 that is impossible for me to calculate, and that's the resistance to interruption. It's something that can technically go from 100 to 0% of your damage, and it's based on so many factors that it simply comes down to you and what team you decide to play in. I don't really like to give recommendations on this, but keep in mind that this entire video showcased C0 R1 Neuvillette with C0, maybe R1 teammates. And now it's time to get into some useless knowledge territory. You probably know of this range for his source water droplets, which is also about the range of your charger attack. I want to point out something really unintuitive about the way he absorbs droplets. Seeing this line makes you think that the absorption range is a circle around him, but it's actually way more complicated than that. He has 2 different and overlapping detection ranges. A cone that is tied to your camera and where you are facing, and then a rectangle that is fixed to Neuvillette, and this one is offset in a way that makes the detection range longer where Neuvillette is facing. So in practice, if Neuvillette is facing the same way as the camera, droplets that are behind you are a bit harder to absorb, and the ones on your left or right are much harder to absorb. And this can be somewhat fixed by, obviously, rotating the camera, or even just by rotating Neuvillette himself, which would increase the total area of detection. Hey, I told you this was useless knowledge, but it was fun to discover because I thought it was much simpler than it is. And it's obviously a very rare case use, because his skill and burst summon the droplets in a very convenient way. All the credits for these findings are in the description, by the way. Also, while researching this video, I found out that his Spirit Breath Thorns, the Numa hit, actually have hit lag. So yeah, Neuvillette can plunge after a skill. This is also absolutely useless and best way to remind you to subscribe if you enjoyed the video and want to support my content. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.